Speaking of stunning stupidity, I don't know, you've heard of this movement now. It's actually, I can't figure out if it's growing momentum or if people are wanting to make it popular by just talking about it, if the media has something to do with this. But you've heard this, JC, trying to turn DC into a state.
Right.
Right?
For more Democrat votes.
Well, I don't think that's totally it, though.
What else is it?
It's about power. See, our founders really, really warned against this whole DC. First off, most people don't realize they didn't like the idea of having what they called a federal city, right? So DC is only 10 miles square, and they called it a federal city. Just so you guys can see, we're going to put up the language of the Constitution right here. And this is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. We'll put it up there. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may, by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States. And to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislators of the state, in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. Right? So this is our federal property clause. This is the only property the federal government is constitutionally allowed to own. Nothing else are they allowed to own, right there. So in order to make Washington, D.C. a state, just to sort of put this out there from the very beginning, you're going to have a constitutional amendment. This is not just like a territory filing to become a state, because Washington, D.C. is already classified in the Constitution as a federal city. It's not supposed to be there, a state. And they did this with specific intent. I want to show you some of the things that were said. Look at what this guy says. This is great, because they hated a lot of the anti-federalists, and even Madison had problems with the idea of a federal city. Because here's what they said. All of this foreign money is going to flow through this one city, which then is distributed throughout the states in the form of foreign treaties and commerce. How can you possibly have that much money in one place and not have corruption galore, right? So here's just one of the things that I wanted to show you. This is Thomas Treadwell at the New York Ratifying Convention. He says, the plan of the federal city. See, it's supposed to be just a city. And the whole purpose of it, as Madison says, is to give the legislators a place to live when they are in session. Because remember, they're not supposed to be in session 24/7. So the plan of the federal city, sir, departs from every principle of freedom, as far as the distance of the two polar stars from each other. For subjecting the inhabitants of that district to the exclusive legislation in Congress, in whose appointment they have no share or vote, is laying a foundation on which may be erected as complete tyranny as can be found in the Eastern world. Nor do I see how this evil can possibly be prevented without raising the foundation of this happy place where men are to live without labor upon the fruit of labors of others. You see, people don't work in D.C. They don't earn money in D.C. They earn the fruits of other people's labors. He calls them the drones in the society to feed on the honey of the land, and that this was as dangerous as what would happen in Rome. So
yeah, DC just sucks money from all the other states, from all the states.
Right. But then what you have is if you make Washington, D.C. a state, then you have a state full of people. Are you going to have a separate legislation? because DC as a state doesn't have its own legislation. All the representatives are representing people from everywhere else. So you have a state then whose legislative body, because the Constitution established that Congress has full authority. So you have a state whose legislative authority is run by every other representative of every other state, where the legislature really only gets a very, well, they'll get one vote in Congress on how the entire state runs.
It's still my contention, just like Chris said in the chat room, there's no need for physical DC anymore. It's an absurdity. We've technologically moved beyond that necessity. There really is no reason for there'd be no K Street if there was no DC.
Let me show you guys something, because this is really interesting for those of you who would like some homework.
We have Zoom. Why do we need DC?
Yeah, exactly. But I wanted to show you, for those of you who want a little homework, this is James Madison on the location of the Capitol and the House of Representatives. Remember, DC is supposed to be a federal city whose only purpose is the place where the representatives live when they're in session. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but there is a huge debate. You need to go read this. This is Madison on September 21st, 1789. I'm just going to scroll down so you can see the length of it. But you need to understand, if you're going to understand this DC thing, what exactly is the conversation that they were having? Do you know why DC is where it needs to be? Or why they put DC where it is?
Cheap land.
Because it was to be centered in the population. Right? So when you have the judiciary, when you have Congress, when you have all of these things in a place, then it needs to be centrally located so that one area is not more benefited than the other, which goes along now with your premise that DC has outlived itself because it is no longer in the center of the union.
Mm-hmm.
If you want the federal city to be an actual federal city by the design of our founders, then that federal city needs to be in the center of the union.
Didn't we drive? We drove through the town that was the center of America. Where was that? I don't remember where that. Let's see. Geographic center of the United States is right outside of northwest center of Lebanon, Kansas.
Right.
Which I think they call Lebanon something. So Kansas. Should be in Kansas.
So Madison says, if a federal town, remember,
Nebraska.
It's just a city. If a federal town be necessary, he says, for the residents of Congress and the public officers, it ought to be a small one. Right? Because remember, the federal government is supposed to be very limited and defined, which means, well, DC has too many in population and too many buildings and too many agencies because we have the federal government doing a whole bunch of things that they're not supposed to be doing.